All right, so let's get right into it. Have you ever wondered how some spiritual groups draw a line between what they consider true teaching and what they call false? Well, today we're digging into a source text that gives a specific playbook for doing just that. It's all about a concept called spiritual discernment, and we're going to break down exactly how this particular perspective sees it. So yeah, let's dive in.
So, the source we're looking at kicks things off with this classic warning. And it's a really powerful image, right? It totally sets the stage for everything else we're going to talk about. This idea that some teachings can look completely authentic on the surface, but underneath, there's something else going on. And that's exactly why this source argues that believers have to be on guard.
Okay, so that naturally leads to the big question, right? According to this source, how do you actually tell the difference? What are the specific signs you should be looking for? Well, the text lays out a pretty clear framework, and we're about to walk through it step by step.
So, here's the plan for our explainer. First, we'll cover that warning against deception. Then, we'll look at some groups the source uses as examples. After that, we'll get into the profile of what it calls a false prophet. And finally, we'll finish up with its advice on how to develop discernment. Pretty straightforward.
All right, first up, a warning against deception. This is really the core premise of the whole source text.
So the big takeaway here is that this is really a call to action. The text is basically saying that just passively listening to teachings isn't enough. It argues that believers have a personal responsibility to, do their own research, to test what they're hearing against the scriptures, and to actively protect themselves from what it calls deception.
Okay, so now let's get into the specifics. How does this idea play out in the real world? Well, the source gives us a few case studies of groups it says are often mistaken for Christianity.
And these are the 4 groups the source focuses on. It identifies them as its main examples, arguing that while they might use some similar language or even claim roots in Christianity, their core beliefs are, from this text's perspective, fundamentally different from what it defines as traditional Christianity.
Okay, so let's look at Mormonism first. The source points out some key differences here. For instance, on the nature of God, you have the traditional Christian view of the Trinity versus a belief in separate divine beings. It also highlights different views on who Jesus is, what counts as scripture, the Bible alone versus the Bible plus other texts, and how salvation is achieved.
Now, for Jehovah's Witnesses, the source again highlights the rejection of the Trinity. It claims they view Jesus not as God, but as a created being, specifically Michael the Archangel. And again, you see different perspectives on what salvation requires and what the afterlife looks like, a paradise on earth versus the traditional heaven and hell.
Next up is Christian Science, and here, the source argues the differences go even deeper, right down to the nature of reality itself. It says that Christian Science teaches the material world is basically an illusion, which is of course a huge contrast to the mainstream Christian view that both the material and spiritual worlds are very real. And from there, the text says you get different ideas about healing and the role of Jesus.
And the last case study is Unitarian Universalism. Here, the source points out an emphasis on God's unity, which means a rejection of the Trinity. It also describes their view of Jesus as more of a moral teacher or prophet, not the divine Son of God. And a really key difference the source brings up is the ultimate authority for belief. Is it scripture, or is it individual experience and reason?
All right, so we've looked at the specific groups the source mentions. Now let's zoom out a bit. The text also gives us a more general profile, kind of a checklist of characteristics for what it would call a false prophet.
So here's the core definition according to this text. And it really all boils down to one thing: motivation. It says a true prophet is all about humbly serving other people. A false prophet, on the other hand, is supposedly all about personal gain and self-promotion.
And here are some of the first red flags the source says to look out for. It's all about self-interest. Are they motivated by greed? Do they have these elaborate schemes to get money? And does it seem like they're more concerned with their number of followers than with teaching scripture accurately?
And to back this up, the source points to this verse from 2 Peter. It basically uses this passage to say, look, the Bible warns about this. The argument is that using insincere language, feigned words, to make money off of people is a classic sign of a false teacher.
Okay, so beyond motivation, the next set of red flags is about the actual content of what's being taught. The source uses the word heresy for anything it sees as contradicting the Bible. It especially calls out 2 big ones: denying that Jesus was both fully God and fully human, and twisting scripture to make it seem like a get-rich-quick scheme. A health and wealth gospel.
And for that point about who Jesus is, here's the scriptural backing the text offers.
It holds up this verse from 1 John almost like a litmus test. The idea is that a teacher's view on whether Jesus was both human and divine is a really critical test for telling what's what.
All right, we're heading into the home stretch. Our last section is all about what to do with this information. After laying out all these potential problems, the source gives some very practical advice for believers on how to navigate all this.
And the advice it gives is really proactive. It's not about just sitting back. First, it says, know the voice of Jesus. Basically, study his teachings so you can recognize the real thing. Second, evaluate your teachers. Don't just listen to their words, but look at their character. Are they humble? And third, search the scriptures. The idea is to always double-check that what you're being taught actually lines up with the Bible.
And it doesn't stop with just protecting yourself. The source also lays out how to respond when you encounter what it considers false teaching. It says to test teachers by asking direct questions about their foundational beliefs. It also says not to be afraid to confront the teaching itself, and to always work on grounding yourself and others in what the scripture actually says.
And that brings us to our final thought. This source we've been exploring, it's trying to tackle a huge challenge, right? It lays out a very specific, very structured path for finding what it defines as truth. But it kind of leaves us with a much bigger question to ponder. When different faiths and different interpretations collide, how does anyone really find the truth? It's a complex world out there, and that's definitely something worth thinking about.